Huh? Go. Hey guys, super good to meet you all. My name is Gabe Pohl-Zaretsky. I work for Gauntlet Networks, and today we're going to be talking about DeFi incentives and how to run your protocol like a business and not like a Ponzi scheme. So, first of all, my name's Gabe. I have a bunch of experience working in high-frequency trading for the past 3 years, mostly at companies like Jane Street and other global trading systems, both like sort of algorithmic trading firms. I've been working at a company called Gauntlet for the past year and a half, basically using my expertise in traditional finance and try to apply those things that we've learned there to the more DeFi market. So most recently, I've been working with SushiSwap to build a statistical model to basically set their token incentives. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Gauntlet as a platform is a financial modeling platform that uses sort of techniques that we take from the traditional finance sector and move it into informing on-protocol, on-chain management to help inform DeFi protocols about how to maximize both overall output as well as minimize risk. So what are we going to be talking about today? So basically the biggest takeaway that I want you guys to take away from this is that DAOs are corporations. And we like to, in crypto, think that we're doing something completely separate and completely novel. But in a lot of ways, what we're doing is been done before, right? So if you think about shares, you can call those tokens. You think about VC raises, IPOs, those are token emissions and ICOs. Shareholders, token holders, board of directors, core team. All of these things have corollaries in the real world equities market, and we have to treat our businesses like businesses. And if we don't, we're not going to see the growth that we want to and know that we can achieve. So the question then is, what do we actually have to think about? What do we have to analyze to make sure that we're building long-term, sustainable businesses that drive long-term revenue both to our shareholders as well as to our users of our protocols? So the most important thing as a business is, how are you spending money? You have a budget that you're currently allocating. In our form, it's token emissions. So how are DAOs currently spending money? So let's go through a couple examples. So first of all, we can look at Curve Finance. Curve Finance has, if you look at their overall token emission schedule over the 4 years, about $11.6 billion in total token emissions that they're going to be spending over that time. And where does that go? So if you look at the pie chart, you see about a little over half goes to liquidity mining incentives, about 36% goes to shareholders and founders, quite a little bit to community through airdrops, and then you also have an employee fund for new employees to be hired later on. You see a fairly similar thing with Balancer. About 75% of their liquidity mining incentives go to liquidity mining incentives, 25% to shareholders. And again, we're talking about a large amount of money, about $1.5 billion over the lifetime of their protocol. Same thing with DYDX, 50% towards liquidity mining, 27% shareholders, founders, employees. You see a very similar picture. And again, we're talking about a huge amount of money, $7.8 billion over the lifetime spending of their protocol. Lastly, Compound Finance, similar story, 40% liquidity mining, shareholders, founders, governance incentives, employees, almost half a billion dollars over the lifetime of the protocol at current token prices. So first of all, we're talking about a huge amount of money. And second of all, you guys might have noticed a trend. Liquidity mining incentives are huge. It's what most of these protocols spend most of the money on. And so it's absolutely imperative that they get these mining incentives right, and they're making the most use out of their incentives as possible. So what are liquidity mining incentives to the uninitiated? This is something that DeFi protocols use to attract capital towards things called liquidity pools. So there's used in a variety of ways and a variety of different mechanisms. So first of all, you might have decentralized exchanges, right? Uniswap, SushiSwap, Curve, Balancer. And they're using these incentives to draw in capital into automated market makers so that people can trade on these platforms. You also have lending protocols, Maker, Compound, Aave, Liquidity, doing a very similar thing, except instead they're enabling people to borrow and lend crypto on these platforms. You also have derivative protocols, DYDX, Synthetics, Ribbon, all of which are doing a very similar thing, attracting capital, attracting liquidity providers to make it so that their protocols can function. And so this is incredibly important. These protocols don't work without these incentives, and they also don't work without this liquidity. So that's why they put such an emphasis on these liquidity mining incentives in the first place. So if you really get down to it, liquidity mining is an optimization problem. So we can make some assumptions. We can assume protocols exist to maximize profit or some other kind of objective function. Protocols have a fixed budget to spend, usually set by governance, although of course this can be changed through later on votes. And then protocols have a fixed number of pools in which they can actually allocate that budget. So if you formalize that, right, you can then just construct that as a mathematics problem of maximize expected profit as some sort of a function given an allocation of pool budgets, subject to that the overall budget is constrained by the total budget that the protocol has allocated. So this is the problem that protocols are trying to solve, and currently they're really not doing a very good job. It's a hard optimization problem. So we can take a look at Trader Joe, which is a pretty large DEX currently on Avalanche protocol. And we can look at what their liquidity mining incentives are currently doing. So if we look at two competing pools, you have USDC, USDT on Avalanche, and then you also have USDC AVAX pool. And if you look at these two pools, you see that the statistics about these pools don't really seem to line up, right? So if you look at the stablecoin pool, you have $39 million in liquidity, $2.3 million in daily volume, which generates around $6,000 in fees at a daily reward of $14,500. So if you kind of crunch the numbers there, that gives you a liquidity utilization of 5%. And what that means is for each dollar in liquidity, how many dollars in volume are you generating? And then so the cost of that liquidity, just by taking the total amount of liquidity and dividing it by the total amount of incentives that they're spending, is $157 of liquidity per $1 in Joe token. So what this means is Trader Joe is currently spending $1 in incentives to attract $157 in liquidity. And then if you look at it from a revenue perspective, in terms of the fees that they're generating, they're spending $1 in incentives to generate 43 cents in revenue. Now, there might be good reasons for this. Maybe they're trying to drive growth. Maybe they value this pool for some particular reason. But if you contrast that with a different pool, if you look at the USDC AVAX pool on Trader Joe, you see that this pool is by far more productive. It has $163 million in liquidity, so it's quite a lot larger. But for that liquidity, they're getting $72 million in volume, generating $185,000 in fees at a cost of only $140,000 in rewards. So the liquidity utilization here is 44%. Every dollar in liquidity drives 44 cents in volume, so it's over 20 times that of the USDC pool. And the cost of liquidity is $905 of liquidity per $1 in Joe, so it's almost 9 times bang for buck in terms of liquidity itself. Now, if you think about the most important thing, which is revenue, Joe is actually in the AVAX pool earning $1.30 in revenue in terms of fees for every dollar that they're spending incentives. So just at a very quick pass, it becomes very clear to anyone looking at this that Joe would probably be doing pretty well to move some incentives from USDC, USDT into the USDC AVAX pool. And so why aren't they doing this, right? So there's sort of the issue of like, how do you make these decisions? How do you figure this all out? So from talking to quite a lot of protocols about this, the way most of the protocols do this is essentially through gut feel. So protocols have either sort of one quant with an Excel spreadsheet, or they're just kind of setting things based on like what they feel is right. So the broke approach, gut feel, you just kind of set what seems right. The woke approach is you're kind of using more quantitative heuristics. So you have some sort of an Excel spreadsheet, you're using some heuristics. And while this works better than what we've seen for a lot of protocols, it's still not quite exactly the most utility maximizing way to be setting these incentives. So that's why we at Gauntlet have been working on incentive optimization products. And the goal there is basically to create statistical models to very quantitatively and very scientifically set these incentives across the various protocols that use them to maximize this impact for this huge amount of spend that protocols are currently doing. So we can take a look at our model architecture. Basically what we're doing is we pull on a variety of on-chain data. So we're pulling in data both from sort of like pool performance, understanding what's going on in the market, and then we also run a variety of sort of off-chain simulations in various analytic platforms. We then download that into our internal data stores where we can build business intelligence dashboards that we can then show protocols to give them a deeper understanding as to what's going on in their internal pools. And then using that data, we can train statistical models, both trying to predict the relationship between incentive and liquidity, as well as the relationship between liquidity and volume. So what that means is basically we're trying to predict what will happen if you increase incentives in a pool. If we increase incentives in the USDC pool by 10%, how much liquidity do we expect to inflow or outflow based on that change? And that's a very difficult problem. It requires us to understand LP behavior. Some LPs are more elastic than others and more likely to respond to those changes. And then after that, we're also trying to predict the relationship between liquidity and volume. If you increase liquidity by 10%, how much do you expect volume to increase by? And this is always a moving target. As market conditions change, as the utilization of pools change, some tokens moon, some tokens go down. You always need to be readjusting these models based on real-time data to understand exactly what's going on. And that's exactly what we've built at Gauntlet. So once you have these two models, it actually becomes a fairly simple optimization problem, right? So you plug in these two elasticity models into a customizable incentive spend optimizer, where the protocol can come to us and say, these are our goals with these pools. In the most simple case, maximizing overall volume. In more complicated cases, it might be making sure there's like a minimal amount of liquidity for partner tokens, native tokens, something along those lines. We then plug these models into an optimizer, and that enables us to do two things. First of all, it allows us to do what-if analysis, where protocols can come to us and say, if we were to decrease our overall incentives by 10%, what's going to happen? Are we going to lose liquidity? Are we going to lose volume? How much? And it allows protocols to sort of answer questions about what's going to happen before they actually do it, to enable them to make the best possible decisions that maximize the utility of the protocol. The other thing, and this is the more impactful thing we're able to do with this, is actually generate incentive recommendations. So this is what we've been doing for SushiSwap for the past year, where we've actually been setting the incentive recommendations and allocations across all of their pools. And so based on that, we can then go on-chain and actually execute those incentive recommendations, set all of the incentives for the pools, And then after that, we can then actually update our models based on what we view as feedback from that data. So we may increase liquidity in a pool based on a belief that it's going to have this impact. After making that change, we will then ingest that data and understand how that change affects the pool itself in real time. The models will then ingest that data and update themselves accordingly. And then the next set of recommendations that we're going to generate are going to be incorporating that data to make sure they're as accurate as possible. So how well does this work? With SushiSwap, we've seen pretty strong results. Based on our platform, Sushi was able to increase their efficiency by about 5x. What that means is basically for every dollar that Sushi was spending in incentives, we were able to increase the amount of volume that they were seeing for that by about 5 times. And that leads to about $300 million in daily volume based on the product that we're selling. We've also been working with Balancer on sort of fee optimization, doing a somewhat similar thing, trying to sort of tune their protocol to make things as efficiently as possible. So the key takeaways here are, first of all, that protocols are a business. They need to be worrying about revenue and spending. You can't simply sort of throw money and do things totally ad hoc. Protocols spend a ton of money on liquidity mining incentives. It's the most important things for protocols to be thinking about. A systematic quantitative approach is absolutely necessary to be doing this. You can't just rely on gut feel. We're talking about too much money and too much spending to just leave it there. And that's what we're doing at Gauntlet. So if you're a protocol that's interested in this product, come find me. I'm super happy to connect. You can also send us an email or follow me on Twitter. The other thing is we're hiring. So if you're a data scientist or an engineer or a salesperson who's interested in this type of product and would like to work with us, come find me. More than happy to chat as well. But happy to answer any questions, I don't know, up here or later after the stage. But yeah, thank you guys so much for your time.